Pray with me. Father, I thank you so much for your word and the truth that it brings to our life. God, I pray that this morning that you'd speak to us in ways that we need to hear it. God, I pray that the mothers are having a great Mother's Day, even though we may be physically apart from our children. Lord, I pray that they would still have a great Mother's Day. God, I pray that today, as we dive into learning about a mother's heart for her kids, pray that we would continue to just strive to be the people you want us to be. God, I pray for your love to just show through our mothers, and God, that their example would point us to you in all things that we do. And I pray that you'd continue to just use your word to refine our hearts to become more like you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So this week we're going to talk about the mother of the sons of thunder. If you don't know who they are, the sons of thunder are James and John, and Salome is the mother of James and John, and she is the wife of Zebedee. And I'll unpack that a little bit as we go. I'll just remind you what we talked about last week and what we've been talking about the coming weeks is that we are chosen people, that Christ has chosen us to be his followers. And it's a marvel that he chooses us, but it's also a marvel in the sense that he chooses things that the world considers foolish and shameful or weak or lowly and despised. And we could add to that list, Jesus selected people with no understanding, no humility, no faith, no commitment. If anything, that fits a pretty broad category of people, doesn't it? That fits pretty much anybody in the universe could be chosen by God. And that is in fact what he has done. He is calling the whole world to himself. The problem is not everybody chooses him. So we want to choose Christ and be considered a part of this lowly gaggle, the foolish that want to follow after him. So this week I want to talk about the sons of thunder, and the sons of thunder being James and John. Their calling started in Mark chapter 1. It records this way: as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Now that was Andrew and Peter, they're called. They're fishermen. And then as they were going, it says in verse 19, when he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John at a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that the father did not detain James or John. When Jesus comes up and says, come follow me, Zebedee clearly he's okay with it. Otherwise, you would have seen some kind of mention here of maybe possibly that the father Zebedee didn't approve or something, but you see that there's nothing of the sort. The other thing that's interesting here, I just want to point out, is that Zebedee was a man of influence. He was apparently a very successful fisherman, because it said here, James and John left his father with the hired men and followed after Jesus. So Salome and Zebedee used their influence, I believe, at times, and were able to help Jesus in his ministry. They fed him. They probably were kind of a way station for Jesus at times. Regardless, Zebedee and Salome were clearly on board with the sons following after Jesus. Then we get to Matthew 20. It says here, this is a passage that we read last week, but now we're going to read it with a little bit of different perspective. Last week we looked at it from the perspective of their lack of humility. This week we're going to look at it from the idea of a mother's heart and her desire for her kids. In verse 20 it says that the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down asked a favor of him. What is it you want? He asked. She said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other on your left in your kingdom. Now, the James and John are noted often for their zeal. James particularly is noted for having a zeal. It's interesting here. I think part of that zeal probably comes from Salome, the mom. Don't know if she was asked by the brothers or if she came up with this on her own. Regardless, we know she was willing to seek out what she thought was the best for her boys. And what was the best at this time? Well, Jesus was what was best. Something all moms should know, and to be on the side of Jesus is to be about his work in his kingdom. That's what should want for our kids. Notice she knelt before Jesus. Although mom is supreme at the house and she runs everything, we notice here that mom here she knows who is worthy to bend the knee towards, and that's Jesus. When a mother feels like she needs answers, because I've heard mothering can be quite hard. Uh, who do you ask questions for? Well, again, Salome, she picks Jesus. Jesus is the man with the answers, because he knows the whole universe, because he is God. He's God of the universe. So it's very fitting that moms, we should look for answers from the one who has all the answers in the world, and that's Jesus. So Salome's heart here, her question, she wants places of honor for her boys, which is not a bad thing for mothers to want. Parents should always seek out what is best for their children. Um, she has likely heard Jesus talk about a kingdom before at this point, but what kind of kingdom is possibly in her mind? That's really the question. Most likely, she's probably thinking about an earthly kingdom, not the heavenly one that Jesus keeps trying to redirect everyone towards. Like others, she's probably struggling to understand this heavenly kingdom, and it's possible. She's thinking any day now, Jesus will set up an earthly authority in the kingdom, and she would want her kids to be right there in authority with him. Um, Even if she did understand it to be a heavenly kingdom, um, or like an afterlife kingdom or of some sort, um, it's still incredibly bold for her to go before Jesus and do this. So I would suggest that some of that zeal that James and John have is from mom. Um, we don't really know for sure, but so where did she get off asking for this kingdom? That's really the question. And what's the context in which led up to this conversation? If you backtrack into Matthew 19, you'll see that Jesus was talking to a crowd of people, and possibly Salome and the boys were there. And he says, I say to you, that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Jesus immediately follows this up with the words, many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. But it was a promise of thrones that caught the attentions of James and John in chapter 19. So when you get to chapter 20 and they're asking about, sitting on the left and right, they're thinking thrones. They're not thinking spiritual kingdoms and so forth. What's interesting, I think, is they decided to have their mother request this rather than they request this. We go back to Matthew 20 now. And it says here, Jesus in verse 22, it says, you don't know what you're talking about. Jesus said to them, can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? And they answer, we can, they answered. Now, Jesus handles her question with a question, but it appears he directs it towards the boys and not at mom. Mom may be trying to intercede, but in the end, all must account for themselves before Jesus. You see, parents can influence faith on their kids, but they can't decide for them. In the end, kids and children must decide, and it must be their own faith. It must be their own personal faith in Christ. And I think this is kind of true here, what's going on. We all have to answer before Jesus as individuals. Mom can certainly pave the road. She can help us make good choices. But in the end, we must take the action to choose faith on our own. Now, as for James and John, you again see the house of Zebedee is full of zeal for the Lord. They ambitiously answer, we can do it. In other words, not even knowing what this cup looks like. You notice that Jesus says, can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? It doesn't describe what that cup exactly is going to look like. But they, without hesitation, seem to be like, yeah, we can do it, sure. Now, we come to find out later, Jesus is talking about a cup of suffering. In the meantime, these guys are already in the inner circle and probably thought they deserved an honor. I mean, why not them? I mean, they're part of that inner circle. So it seems like a logical jump in their mind to conclude, like, hey, they should be able to have the seats to the left and right of Jesus. But I think they're missing. Well, we know that they're missing out on the whole thing of what's going on here. What we don't often realize is greatness with God comes with suffering. Jesus had already mentioned in the prior chapter, in verse 19, or chapter 19 rather, Jesus had already mentioned to all of them that he was going to die on the cross. If they had really been paying attention about his kingdom and all his talks about the kingdom, they might have connected that the cross is really the throne in which Jesus sits upon. What they were asking is not a throne, but a cross to lay on his right and left. If they really knew what this cup was, I wonder if they would still have asked it. If they had connected the dots. So we live on the other side of this. We do now know that the cup Jesus offers, it's still the same for us. It's a cup of suffering. And the question really could be asked, are we willing to suffer in the name of Christ? Is he worth following to the point of rejection? Rejection from the world, rejection from all the standards that the secular society wants us to follow after? Are we willing to be called foolish in the face of loving Christ being more important to us? Our suffering pales in comparison to what they must have faced. But yet still, we have the hindsight, we have the connected dots, if you will, to say that we know enough that following Jesus is a calling to potential rejection from this world. So knowing that, would we still ask the question, or would we still want to seek positions of honor in Christ's kingdom? Verse 23, Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right and my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared for by my Father. This is a kind of a subtle answer at the moment. I don't think they fully, again, understood what they were volunteering for, because Jesus didn't explain what that cup was all about. But again, we have the hindsight to know now that Jesus was following Jesus is not going to be easy. We have the dots connected for us. Jesus made it clear that the cup is theirs, but the seats are not part of the bargain. Only the Father knows who sits in these places. Now, he says that to whom it is prepared. The names are not mentioned, so we are to assume it might not be them. It could be anyone, is really what it kind of is left open to. But spiritually speaking, I think Jesus didn't answer, not because it wasn't open or that it's like an open competition for these seats, per se. I think these seats misses the point of everything. I think the fact that anybody would be seeking for the left and right hand of God in the kingdom is kind of missing the whole point of whole kingdom talks in the first place. I think Jesus is saying, if you're a follower, I think all believers sit in the place of honor beside Jesus. Jesus often talks about the church as being the bride of Christ. We all make up that bride. So in a sense, we all, in a spiritual sense, will sit beside him. Jesus talks about going to prepare a place for those who follow after him in glory. There is a true sense of honor for all believers that will all share the glory in God in the kingdom of heaven forever. So verse 24, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant, and the two brothers, because obviously they were a little bit jealous by even asserting that they should have these positions of authority. But verse 25 says, Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first, be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, Salome wanted a crown of glory for her boys. What Jesus was offering was a crown of suffering, but they didn't quite get that. Before they could receive any glory, they had to receive suffering. Now, they wanted authority, and Jesus offered them servanthood and slavery in an answer here. They wanted preeminence. And Jesus eventually is going to offer them a martyr's grave. They wanted to basically be rulers, and Jesus offered them a sword, and it was not a sword that they would wield as rulers, but as an instrument of execution for them. James is the only disciple whose death is actually recorded in Scripture itself. It's in Acts 12. Ironically, there are 3 James in Scripture. James the Lesser, the son of Alphaeus, and James, the half-brother of Jesus. And then this is the James the Great. He's the son of Zebedee and the son of Salome. And he gets the title Great. Not probably because of this conversation about greatness that he's seeking. It's probably more to do with the fact that he was a bigger man than James, the son of Alphaeus, who was considered James the Lesser. So he's concerned, ironically, about greatness, and he's eventually called and given this title of James the Great. But he learned eventually to be great in the way Jesus described wasn't the way he was thinking. John also was suffering for the sake of the gospel. He's the only apostle that lived to old age. However, tradition, even though he wasn't martyred, it holds that he suffered in many other ways, like he was burned alive in a hot oil cauldron before being banished to the island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. So, again, Jesus turns the question around on them. They want one thing, but Jesus offers them an entirely different thing. And I think the same is true. I think a lot of people sometimes get this idea that life is just going to be wonderful following after Jesus, when in fact, really, Jesus is not calling us to a fat and plushy life here on this earth. He's calling us to a life of servitude, a life of slavery, and a life of possible hardships. Now, again, our suffering pales in comparison to what these men had to go through. The rejection that we face in this world is really quite nothing, honestly, compared to what they had to deal with. So, yes, Jesus is calling us to servanthood and to suffering and so forth, but we can't even begin to describe our suffering as something real next to what these guys had to endure for talking about the faith. Now, why the Sons of Thunder? Why did they get this name? And this zeal that I keep referring to that they had. In Luke 9, it kind of gives, here's the backdrop of this. This is Jesus is traveling throughout the countryside, and he's waking. It says here in verse 51, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into Samaria, into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him, because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" Now, a little bit of backdrop, a little bit of history. Samaritans are mixed people group. They're Jews that basically intermarried. They were part of the tribe, the 12 brothers, and part of the 10 tribes that divided. The Jews from the south didn't like the half-Jews from the Samaritans in the north. They argued about places of worship, and as a result, the kingdom divided. And when the tribes split in the Old Testament, the Samaritans, or the Jews who intermarried, were the northern kingdom and the northern tribe, and they set up their own place of worship, and it was Samaria. Now, Jesus was headed towards Jerusalem, it says here in this passage. Now, this is, of course, a disputed place of worship. The Samaritans worshipped here on this hill. Jesus worshipped in Jerusalem. So naturally, the Samaritans at this time didn't want Jesus to come through their place because they held a grudge against them, and the others held a grudge against them. So this is partly why James and John reacted the way they did, just as you and I might poorly, react to things when we let the past influence our decisions. Sometimes we might hold a grudge or react poorly. Now, it goes a little bit deeper than that. Why the grudge there's more to it than that. So as the kingdom, again, as I mentioned, that these two kingdoms divided in the Old Testament, and you had this northern tribe of 10, and then a southern tribe of 2. What you have is this northern king, the first one, one of the first ones, Ahab, who's a king who he turned the place of Samaria into Baal worship. Now that's the place where Jesus is at right now. And one of his successors, Ahaziah, he fell from his palace and basically injured himself. And so Ahaziah sends a messenger to inquire of some priest of Beelzebub for his future to find out whether or not he's going to live or die. Beelzebub, by the way, is it means god of flies. The Jews later kind of, in a mockingly way, called him in Hebrew Beelzebul, which means god of dung. So you can tell what the Jews thought of their alleged god. And Jesus himself even uses the term Beelzebub later in referring to Satan. So these messengers are sent from Ahaziah to find out whether or not he's going to live or die. And Elijah intercepts these messengers as they're trying to go find a priest of Beelzebub. And he sends word that back. He says, messengers, I already got a word for you. Go back to Ahaziah, tell him he's going to die. So Ahaziah doesn't like that word. So he sends 50 men with his captain twice to Elijah. And when they show up to Elijah, they say, man of God, you need to come with us. And Elijah says, well, if I'm a man of God, let fire come down and consume you. And they burned up. 2 times. You'd think Ahaziah, after the first one, would be like, well, I'm not sending anybody after. But he sends them yet not once, twice. And both times they burn up. And then a third time he sends a captain, but this captain's a little more humble. And he begs for the life of his men. And Elijah is told by the Lord, okay, now you can go and appear before Ahaziah. And he does this time. He goes personally to Ahaziah and gives him a message of doom. So James and John had biblical precedents to want to burn down the Samaritans. They knew their Bible. They knew this place. They knew Elijah. They knew this instance of Elijah calling down fire on these soldiers. So when they dishonor Jesus in such a way, these guys feel somehow that they have a biblical leg to stand on. It's amazing to me somehow we can read our Bible and miss the heart of God. Now Jesus gives us a whole new unified version of understanding this place, this Samaritan place. Yes, Satan is bad, and worshiping any other god that's not the true God, like worshiping Satan or Beelzebub, is bad. However, the context is different here. Jesus is not doing what Elijah did, and the Samaritans are not acting like Ahaziah did. Yes, it is sad and tragic that they don't welcome Jesus like they should. It's sad in this world that anybody rejects Jesus like they do. However, it's not a cause to wipe them out. Could you imagine a world where we just wipe people out for the sin of not welcoming Jesus? We would have no one to preach to. Much less, what about us? I mean, are there not moments in our life that we struggle with welcoming Jesus, to give him, a place to stay in areas of our life, spiritually speaking? Imagine if Jesus called down fire every time we resisted him. I mean, we would all be a hot mess, wouldn't we? So now we get back, and you see Jesus' response in verse 55. He says, but Jesus turned and he rebuked them. And then he and his disciples went to another village. Now, previously, when Jesus had healed a Samaritan leper, you didn't see James and John wanting to call down thunder. Jesus met with a Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. And during that time, Jesus, he didn't let on to this old hostility factors. He didn't let history dictate the way he treated these people and how he talked to them. Jesus even said things like, behold, the fields are ripe for harvest, referring to the crowds of Samaritans that were gathering after the woman at the well went and said, hey, I met a man that told me everything about me. And many of these people became believers. Now, fast forward, And now they're crossing the same path. They're heading towards Jerusalem, and the people that who came to follow Jesus are in these towns, and James and John want to burn it to the ground. So obviously, there's a little conflict of interest going on here, and you don't really get much more than just Jesus says, "I rebuke you." But let's just remember that previously in these places, Jesus showed goodwill towards the Samaritans. And yet James and John are still holding a grudge against them. Often we hold grudges against people that Jesus wants to save, unfortunately. So just as Salome wanted a place of honor for her sons, Jesus wants people to have access to the place of honor. Even those that seem offensive to us, even those that seem to reject Jesus, Jesus is calling us to those kind of people. In Acts 1:8, Jesus commands the apostles to not only preach in Judea, but in Samaria. So Jesus didn't have issues with half-Jews or Gentiles. If anything, he had issues with the alleged pure Jews. The apostles eventually would get it right in the years to come, fortunately, and hopefully we are getting it right now. Jesus, he challenges our preconceived notions of who our enemies really are. Chances are, who you think is an enemy to you now probably isn't. And Jesus didn't come to destroy that person's life. He came to save that person's life. And he's calling you and I now not to be destroyers of lives, but to be fishers of men. We should be in the business of saving lives, just like Jesus was. Jesus made it very clear that the mission he was on was to seek and to save the lost. Luke 19:10, it says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." Matthew 20:28, which we just read, it says, "Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." In other words, he was saving his life was a ransom to save the life of others. John 3:17, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." John 12:46-47 says, "I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. If anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge that person. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world." Over and over and over again, Jesus' message is very clear that he is in the business of saving others. When the revenge business is often something that we have in our mind to do, Jesus has in mind to save those people. Now, if we're going to follow the wisdom of mom, let's just say, and we want a position of honor, and Jesus wants to put others before us, like, that's a hard thing to do. We need to recognize that greatness doesn't come from putting ourselves first. It comes from, and it doesn't come from having vengeance to burn those who reject Jesus to the ground. It comes from continuing to witness to those people. Christ died for others that are even offensive to us, and that should give us hope, because we are offensive at times to Christ. We should be telling people that Christ died for them and has given us hope that we can resurrect one day because he's alive again. Saving lives should be our business, because that is the mission of what Jesus passed on to us. Eventually, you see the zeal that James had to save others throughout. They were really transformed by the message, to the point that they eventually give over their life and service, not to vengeance to others, but to carry out the life-giving words of Christ. Now, appropriately applied, zeal is a good thing. We can have zeal for the Lord, and zeal such that when people dishonor the Lord, that we're not seeking vengeance. Instead, we're seeking for their salvation. So zeal applied in the right way is a good thing. In this passage, we saw that the mom's zeal and the son's zeal was not quite right, but we know they get it right. That we know eventually defending Christ's honor doesn't look like condemning others. It looks like an open hand and an open heart. a willingness to serve our enemies in ways that will basically overcome their doubt in the Savior, and it will cause them to want to believe and follow after Him. The one who dishonored Christ eventually comes to be the one who is saved by Christ. Um, we should rejoice in this. This is good news. This is the news of the gospel, is that um, as many as there are out there that want to dishonor the name of Christ, that's as many as Christ wants to save today still. And we should be happy that they are worth saving and that Jesus continues to save them. Now, what is a mother's mission today? It hasn't changed. A mother's mission is to seek and to save, just as Christ came to seek and to save. Um, you know, verse Luke 23:26 talks about the women who followed Jesus all the way up to his death. It says here, as the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was on his way from the country, and he put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. Now, we learn from Mark 15:40 that some of the women who were in that crowd, watching from a distance, among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. I find it very interesting that even though they stood afar off, they heard these words of Jesus where he says, weep for yourselves and for your children. Now, I wonder if they would also find themselves, along with their kids, in horrible situations in the days to come, because following Jesus brings about, again, rejection from the world. Now, they stand here at the end, still pursuing Christ all the way up to his grave with tear-filled eyes. They show really their devotion to him all the way to the cross, and how they still beheld him, even as he hung there in death. Salome was with those women all the way watching this. Now, also, I'll remind you that Salome was also with the women who came to anoint the body of Jesus. So after the crucifixion, and he's in the grave, 3 days later, they came to anoint his body, and they shared in this glorious event, Easter morning, about the news of his resurrection. In Luke 24, it talks about this, and she came with the other women to perform what they thought would be their last service for Jesus, but instead they were able. They weren't able to because the body was gone. So instead, their devotion was rewarded with an angel shows up and tells them, "Hey, Jesus is alive forever." So Salome got to be the part of the group of women that got to be the first to proclaim that Jesus was alive. So mothers, what is your job? Your job is to tell your children and everyone you know that Jesus is alive. Our shared mission is completely to remind the world that Jesus saves us from sin and brings us into his glory through the belief of his sacrifice for us. One day, believers will rise to life just like Jesus did. We as parents, as mothers, as people, we should all be called to that mission to tell people about what Jesus has done for us. Pray with me. Father, I thank you for this Mother's Day. I thank you for the gift of mothers who deliver us into this world. God, I pray that as mothers continue to raise our kids, I pray that they would continue to remember their mission in life is to seek and to save the lost as well. God, it's the great commission that we're all on. It's the life-changing, ever-fulfilling suffering for you that might bring glory to you in your name. God, I pray that when the going gets tough, when we are offended by others who want to dishonor your name, that somehow we would find ways to not place our zeal in vengeance, but place our zeal into loving them, and loving them in such a way that it would overcome any of their doubts about who you are, Lord, that they would want to put their trust and faith in you through the zeal of our love for you, God, that they might be saved. God, I pray for just continue to watch over us in these tough times, that you continue to just mold us and shape us into the people you want us to be. I pray this all in Jesus' name.